Well, welcome back, everyone. I'm Dr. Brenda Honeycutt, Director of Regulatory Innovation at Faster Cures, a center of the Milken Institute and moderator of this session. It's an honor to introduce our three speakers who will discuss the FDA's Oncology Center of Excellence's current initiatives to advance patient engagement. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Lola Fashoyin-Aje, who is a medical oncologist and Deputy Division Director in the Division of Oncology 3 in the Office of Oncologic Diseases at the FDA. In her current role, she provides scientific and policy guidance and oversight to multidisciplinary teams reviewing drugs and biologics under development for the treatment of solid tumor malignancies. She also serves as the Oncology Center of Excellence Scientific Liaison for Cancer Disparities. Dr. Fashoyin-Aje serves on the ASCO Health Equity Committee, the AACR Science of Cancer Health Disparities Scientific Program and Scientific Review Committees, and the ASCO Cancer Research Committee. Next is Jessica Boehmer, who is a regulatory scientist in the Office of Hematology and Oncology Products at FDA and works with the Associate Director of Regulatory Affairs to provide regulatory advice. She previously served as a Senior Regulatory Project Manager in the Division of Hematology Products. Prior to joining FDA in May 2012, she acquired more than 10 years of experience in the biotechnology industry. Last but certainly not least is Dr. Vishal Bhatnagar, a medical oncologist, hematologist, and Associate Director for Patient Outcomes in the Oncology Center of Excellence. His interests include patient-reported outcomes, patient preferences, and incorporation of patient experience in oncology trials. His work focuses on the operational management of the OCE's patient-focused drug development program. Additionally, Dr. Bhatnagar has a strong clinical interest in multiple myeloma and has previously served as an Office of Hematology and Oncology multiple myeloma scientific liaison. So thank you all so much for joining us. Over to you.
Great, good afternoon. Can you hear me okay? Yes. So it's such a pleasure for my colleagues and I to take part in this program. And I'd like to thank Eleanor for the invitation and Silke for facilitating our participation. So I, along with my colleagues, will be presenting on initiatives at the Oncology Center of Excellence to advance patient engagement externally in all of our activities. Next slide, please. So we were tasked with sharing with you our program on health equity and discussing the various ways that the Oncology Center of Excellence engages patients in our scientific and policy work, including our health equity work. So my colleagues and I will be tag teaming this presentation. I will start by providing an overview of the OCE Scientific and Policy Program to address disparities and the related programmatic areas within the Oncology Center of Excellence. And we'll also summarize some of the ways that the patient perspective has been integrated in our regulatory work. Jessica will discuss specific mechanisms for patient engagement within the FDA, and Vishal will discuss Project Patient Voice, which is an online platform for patient-reported symptom data collected from cancer clinical trials that is really accessible to patients and caregivers and the public at large. Next slide, please. So I'm a medical oncologist, and as you heard, I oversee the review and approval of treatments for GI malignancies, sarcoma, melanoma, and other cutaneous malignancies, and I also lead our scientific and policy program to address cancer disparity in drug development at the Oncology Center of Excellence. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Great, thanks. So it has long been recognized that racial and ethnic minorities are underrepresented in clinical research and in clinical trials. This issue has been the subject of countless publications, calls to action, white papers, blueprints, you name it, for many, many years before this issue has really gained the visibility that it has in recent months. we know that less than 10 to 15% of patients in clinical trials that are submitted to the FDA are from racial and ethnic minority groups. So this level of representation does not reflect, the proportional representation of these groups in the general population, nor does it in most cases, reflect the representation among cases of the disease. So there are certainly factors that are related to the drug development milieu that contribute to these disparities. The first is that, drug development is a global endeavor. And so it is the rare trial that we see nowadays that is conducted solely in the United States. And so the US population has been over a number of years sort of dwindling and currently approximately 20% of US patients are included in the trials that are submitted to the FDA to support approval. So most of these trials are enrolling patients in Europe, in the Eastern European bloc, in Northern Europe, where really the populations lack the diversity that we have in the United States. And so often even these racial and ethnic categories are not necessarily applicable. The other issue is that though this is really not new, it's certainly worthy of mention, is the fact that new treatments can be approved on the basis of trials that are entirely conducted outside the United States, so long as certain conditions are met. And so FDA's first opportunity really to review a trial and to assess its representativeness sometimes occurs when the trial is fully enrolled, at which point, really nothing can be done. So these factors don't, of course, explain, the state of affairs that we see. We know that there are systemic inequalities due to bias and racism that also play an unfortunate role in all of this. And so collective action really is needed to effectively rectify the problem on so many different fronts. Next slide, please. So from my perspective, addressing racial and ethnic disparities and underrepresentation in clinical trials specifically is of vital importance because of two main issues. The first is access. We know that enrollment to a clinical trial provides the fastest access to potentially effective therapies. And so to have subgroups of the population consistently underrepresented in clinical trial means that, patients who belong to those groups are not really afforded access to potentially very promising therapies. This alone can contribute to inferior outcomes in patients who belong to these groups, as we have data that indicates that patients on clinical trials receive the best care compared to their counterparts who are not on clinical trials, and that this care may result in better outcomes. And so particularly for serious diseases like cancer, limited access to therapeutic trials may contribute to poor outcomes in individuals, as I said, who belong to these traditionally underrepresented subgroups in clinical trials and clinical research. The second issue, which is of no more importance than the first, is lack of representation or underrepresentation really hinders evidence generation for the subgroup that is underrepresented. And I think we too often equate lack of data with lack of evidence of difference. And while I think it would be optimal if there were no differences across the population on the basis of race, we do not know that, but we often unfortunately make those assumptions. And so really, we know that clinical trials afford us the primary mechanism to collect information about new therapies. And so if we're not generating data that informs our understanding of how these treatments perform across the entire population that will eventually use the drug once it's approved, we are really doing, we're doing a disservice to patients who belong in those groups and who are asking for this data, quite frankly. Next slide, please. So really, there's been, lots of policy and programs to address this issue, both at the agency level and including within the Oncology Center of Excellence. And this work has been ongoing for many, many years now and has been formalized in the Oncology Center of Excellence more recently. We have issued guidances, as many of you are aware, that specifically address the issue of racial and ethnic groups being underrepresented in clinical trials. These guidances focus on how to collect and present data on racial and ethnic minorities and applications to the FDA. and really stress the importance of prospectively developing a plan to enroll diverse populations onto clinical trials. We also have several guidances that sort of elaborate on our work that we've been doing now for many years to broaden eligibility criteria as a way to facilitate access for many more patients. As you know, this is a well-documented barrier to access to many subgroups in the population, including racial and ethnic minorities. So we also have, issued guidances that encourage, the implementation of practices that really address the logistical barriers to clinical trial participation. We have also launched several campaigns, and this is work that's really mostly been led by the Office of Minority Health and Health Equity at the FDA to really promote the importance of participating in clinical trials and clinical research, and really developing tools to facilitate dissemination of that message by various external stakeholders. At the Oncology Center of Excellence, we have two main programmatic areas to address disparities and inequity in research and trials. The first is our Community Outreach and Engagement Program, which is led by my colleague, Ms. Ria Blakey, who unfortunately is not able to join us today. But this program really leverages the expertise of our scientific and clinical staff to engage with and exchange information with communities that are traditionally underserved. And then we have the Scientific and Policy Program, which I lead, which really serves to coordinate efforts to improve the inclusion of underrepresented demographic subgroups in cancer drug development to generate data that informs the safe and effective use of cancer therapeutics. So this is not just racial and ethnic minorities, but really other underrepresented minorities, some of which we know very little about, including sexual and gender minorities, for example. And then I think an important part of this work is always, seeking diverse perspectives to inform our regulatory decision making. So bringing different voices to the table is something that we're continually seeking to do. Next slide, please. So the specific programs or aims of the Scientific and Policy Program are to increase enrollment in oncology clinical trials, and really the real main goal of this is to increase the data that's collected throughout the life cycle of the drug in the pre-approval setting and the post-approval setting, identify data that may be important to collect very early on in the clinical development of that drug that may inform the need or lack thereof of additional studies that are focused on particular subgroups. The second aim really is to engage in internal and external research and policy efforts. We've been doing this now for quite a number of years. And really the goal of this is really to provide transparency, not only to where we have data gaps, but also sort of what we are seeing from our perspective as a regulatory agency, and how our experiences can inform, policy development, advocacy on these issues, which of course, we cannot do as federal employees. The third is really developing policy and guidance and continually seeking ways to help, industry sponsors really conduct trials that are more inclusive, and then integrating across our programmatic areas within the Oncology Center of Excellence. As you know, we have a pediatric program wherein, we would also want to ensure that, there's equitable access to trials for racial and ethnic minorities as well. And then looking at how we can leverage real world data and real world evidence to inform our regulatory decision making. And Vishal will talk to you about Project Patient Voice later on today. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to sort of give you a broad view of the various OCE activities and where patients and patient advocacy groups have been involved. We, of course, have formal programs within the agency, which Jessica will discuss just after this slide. And so I won't get into those, but within the OCE, we have many workshops, several, typically a year. The COVID-19 pandemic has made it difficult this year to do a lot of this, but we frequently and often, and it's really the rare case that we do not have patient advocacy perspective included in any of our work streams that are external facing and many of which are internal facing, including our mini symposia, our listening sessions within the Oncology Center of Excellence. We regularly participate in conferences and seek to have, patient sessions within ASCO. I know I've participated in many of these, San Antonio Breast Cancer Conference, and so forth. And then we have, research and policy collaborations in the work that we do with other groups, but also work that we are leading ourselves, as well as really making ourselves available for, the various activities that are initiated by the patient advocacy groups, as we really find it important for us to lend support to a lot of that work. So I will turn this over to Jessica to take us through opportunities for patients to engage with FDA. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Hi, good afternoon or good morning, depending where you're tuning in from. My name is Jessica Boehmer, and I'm a regulatory scientist in the Office of Oncologic Diseases at FDA. And Dr. Fashoyin-Aje asked if I would provide a brief overview of some of the opportunities for patients to engage with FDA. Next slide, please. So patient experience can help inform our understanding of medical conditions, and FDA has established several programs to facilitate incorporating patient perspectives into the work we do. And hearing the patient's perspectives not only informs us about the disease or the condition, it also reminds us of the urgency and importance of our public health mission. And over the next few minutes, I'm going to share an overview of the evolution of formal patient engagement programs at FDA, some of the major engagement initiatives, and I'll go a bit more in depth into the FDA Patient Representative Program. I'll also share about the Patients Ask FDA portal, as well as some resources at the end. Next slide, please. Andrea Furia-Helms, who is the Director of FDA Patient Affairs staff, provided this slide which outlines the evolution of formal patient engagement programs at FDA, which originated during the time of the HIV/AIDS crisis during the late 80s and 90s. In 1993, the first FDA patient representative served on an advisory committee, and more recently in 2019, the patient affairs staff launched the Patients Ask FDA online web form for submitting questions to FDA. Next slide, please. Some of the formal patient engagement programs at FDA include patient listening sessions, which are conducted in partnership with the National Organization for Rare Disorders. Through these sessions, patient communities can share their experience with a disease or condition by talking directly with FDA staff. These listening sessions can either be FDA requested, where FDA has a specific set of questions to ask, or patient-led, when the patient community wants to share their perspective with the FDA. Another engagement initiative is the Patient Engagement Collaborative. Established in collaboration with Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, the PEC is comprised of patient organization and individual patient and caregiver representatives who discuss topics focused on enhancing patient engagement in medical product development and regulatory discussions at FDA. PEC was formed in response to stakeholder feedback that an outside group should provide input on patient engagement across the agency. And PEC was modeled after the European Medicines Agency's Patients and Consumers Working Party. Members are expected to serve for 2 to 3 years, and a great deal of emphasis was placed on ensuring involvement of representatives with a variety of perspectives and inclusion of patients, caregivers, and representatives from a diversity of patient organizations. I'll describe the FDA Patient Representative Program in the slides that follow in just a moment. Patient-focused drug development meetings are meant to help ensure that patients' experiences, perspective, needs, and priorities are captured and meaningfully incorporated into the drug development and evaluation. And the Devices Patient Engagement Advisory Committee is a committee made up of patients, caregivers, and representatives of patient organizations. And the FDA Center for Devices and Radiological Health, or CDRH, established the PEAC to help assure that the needs and experiences of patients are included as part of the FDA's discussion on complex issues involving the regulation of medical devices and their use by patients. Next slide, please. Another unique example of an FDA initiative to facilitate engagement with patients are the COVID listening sessions our office, the Oncology Center of Excellence at FDA, recently conducted. Over the past 6 months, our office has held 11 listening sessions on COVID with various patient advocacy groups and stakeholders. Discussions included how to address emerging challenges with conduct of clinical trials and patient experiences in participating in trials during the pandemic. Next slide, please. Next, I'm going to go into deeper detail about the FDA's flagship program for bringing the patient voice into the regulatory process in a formal way, which is the FDA Patient Representative Program. Selena Miller, who manages this program, provided the following slides and metrics on the program. This is the only mechanism that brings patients to the table so they can engage in an official way with FDA review teams. Patient representatives are provided access to confidential company data as part of their assignment, and FDA patient representatives are brought on board as special government or regular government employees for 4-year term appointments. Next slide, please. There are 2 areas in which agency-directed assignments apply to patient representatives: advisory meetings and consults. The primary way is through advisory committees where patient representatives serve as panel members and provide FDA with independent advice on issues related to medical products. Although the committees provide advice to the agency, the FDA is not bound to follow committee recommendations, but historically review decisions often parallel the recommendations of advisory committees. There are 31 advisory committees across all product centers, including Medical Devices Advisory Committee, which has 18 panels. Typically, patient representatives are considered temporary panel members with voting privileges for most committees, except for the devices advisory committees. And in the fiscal year 2020, patient reps were assigned to 36 advisory committees. And in the previous year, 2019, patient representatives were assigned to 45 advisory committees. Next slide, please. The second way patient representatives serve in their roles is as consultants for FDA reviewers and clinical teams much earlier than when an advisory committee is held. Centers often need to consult with patients as they examine applications so that they can better understand a disease and condition or experience with a drug, biologic, or device. As a result, the clinical team is able to make the necessary recommendations to the sponsor on their development program. These consultations are typically held as closed confidential teleconferences. For fiscal year 2019 through 2020, FDA patient representatives had the opportunity to consult with review divisions on 6 of these consult assignments. Next slide, please. You may be wondering, what criteria does FDA use to select patient representatives? Selena Miller, who leads this program, shared that when selecting a patient representative, she works with the FDA review division to make the selection, and the selection is based upon specific criteria. A strong patient representative candidate is someone who has personal experience with the disease or condition or medical device, someone who has community awareness and really can speak not only to their experience, but also that of the patient community. FDA patient representatives are generally not technical experts. They are experts in their disease or condition, and it's helpful if they're knowledgeable about treatment options and research. Someone who can grasp scientific principles and understand complex issues, although they don't necessarily need to be in the healthcare related field. And great communication skills are important. Sometimes those skills get better over time, but having someone who is committed to serve and understands their role is so important and helps them have the confidence to share their perspectives, because sometimes sitting at a table with experts can be intimidating for some. It is also important that the representative is unbiased and has no major financial or ethical conflicts of interest. Next slide, please. Currently, there are a little under 200 patient representatives who advise on anywhere between 300 to 500 diseases, conditions, or device experiences. Currently, they are actively recruiting patient representatives in oncology for disease areas including AML, bladder cancer, desmoid tumors, FAP, multiple myeloma, pancreatic cancer, and triple-negative breast cancer. Next slide, please. In the interest of time, I won't play this video. However, the link is provided in the slides, so those who are interested may watch at a later time. And Gigi is a patient representative who has experience as a caregiver for a patient who has pediatric brain tumors. And here she's talking about her experiences in the patient representative program. Next slide, please. So just to summarize, patient representatives provide valuable insight to FDA, and then we can better advise sponsor companies on their development programs. This can lead to things like better design trials, faster patient recruitment, and improved patient retention, cutting time and cost of product development, and development of meaningful endpoints and measurements, and medical products that better reflect outcome and quality of life measures most important to patients. If you have questions or interests, you may reach out directly to Selena Miller by email, or there's also a link to the webpage on this program which provides additional details. Next slide, please. Next, I'd like to share a little bit about the Patients Ask FDA portal. Co-developed by the Patient Affairs staff and the Medical Product Centers, the patient portal routes inquiries to the appropriate medical product center or office at FDA. We want patients and those who advocate on their behalf to know that at FDA, our door is open. The portal is an opportunity for the patient community to ask a question or request a meeting with FDA. For instance, rare disease listening session requests can be submitted through the portal. The web form supports requests for all medical product centers at FDA. For instance, in oncology, Rhea Blakey is our Associate Director for External Outreach and Engagement. And if you are a member of the patient community with a question particular to oncology, you may utilize the portal and your question will be directed to Rhea. Next slide, please. In closing, I hope you found this quick overview on some of the patient engagement programs across FDA to be helpful. Here are contacts and resources on the various programs, and that concludes my part of the presentation. And I'll now hand over to Dr. Vishal Bhatnagar.
Thank you so much. Next slide, please. So my name is Vishal Bhatnagar. I'm a medical oncologist and the Associate Director for Patient Outcomes in the Oncology Center of Excellence. But before working on patient-focused initiatives, I was a reviewer in the Division of Hematology Products, where I focused on drug development in the area of multiple myeloma. It's my pleasure to participate in this session, and I'll be discussing recent progress in the field of patient-reported outcomes and how this data can be used to disseminate important information to those who need it the most. Next slide. So there are a few main buckets or groups of clinical outcomes assessments, and much of what is in product labeling or discussed in the literature really centers around clinician-reported outcomes, which is listed in the top left corner there. These are measurements based on the observations of a trained healthcare professional. And for many years, there have been rising calls, though, for measurement and analysis of patient-reported outcomes, which is a measurement based on a report that comes directly from the patient about the status of their health without interpretation from a clinician or anyone else. This data has been quite informative for our review, and our goal in the Oncology Center of Excellence is to further research methodologies to allow this data to be incorporated further into oncology drug development and clinical trials. Next slide, please. So patient-reported outcomes have increasingly been included in product labeling. And as you'll see on this slide, there have been many examples of patient-reported outcomes that are included in product labeling that report patient reports of efficacy, safety, and patient experience. And in each case, there was very important information that was included that enhanced the clinician-reported data that was provided. What you'll also note is that this is a very small segment of our overall approvals in a given year. And there are many reasons why patient-reported outcomes may not make it into product labeling, such as methodological issues, instrument selection, data quality. But our goal in the Oncology Center of Excellence is to advise drug developers on ways to avoid those issues. Next slide. So although patient-reported outcomes are usually not included in product labeling, the 21st Century Cures Act, which is relatively recent legislation, really does encourage FDA to review and communicate patient experience data that's collected in trials supporting regulatory approval. And in almost all product applications or clinical trials, PRO data is collected and submitted, and the FDA does review it. But there's a lot of heterogeneity in how this data is presented and analyzed. Lastly, the product label itself has its own limitations. So there's lack of space or color is not allowed in product labeling. So that's a big challenge when trying to communicate very complex data such as patient-reported outcomes data. Next slide. Thank you. So with that context in mind, the Oncology Center of Excellence initiated a pilot project to communicate patient-reported symptom data that was collected in cancer clinical trials that were used for approval. So Project Patient Voice was launched on June 23rd of this year, and it's a public web platform which provides patient experience data. I'd like to stress that the source of this data is from the same trials that were used to support approval on traditional safety and efficacy endpoints. But this data usually doesn't make it out into the public. It's typically provided in either academic literature articles and as I mentioned earlier, occasionally in product labeling, but this is not traditionally public data. Next slide. The inaugural trial on this pilot is AURA3, which studied Tagrisso compared to conventional chemotherapy for non-small cell lung cancer with an EGFR mutation. A proportion of the patients on this trial were asked about their symptoms and side effects using the PRO CTCAE item library, and they were asked about symptoms on a very frequent basis, essentially weekly for the first portion of the study. And here we have a data display for one of those symptoms, and I think here it's nausea. And as you can see on a week-to-week basis, the proportion of patients in each arm is listed there that had no nausea, and then of those patients who did have nausea, there are different grades of that that are provided. And there, I believe 28 symptoms in total. So this is a very rich data source. We envision Project Patient Voice to really be used by patients and their providers, at the same time to discuss certain symptoms or side effects and use this as sort of a talking point to facilitate a discussion about symptoms or side effects that they're concerned about. I'll note that this data is rigorously collected from patients, and that can be used to inform patients about potential symptoms and side effects. We have a vignette that we commonly do when we present Project Patient Voice in workshops, et cetera, where we have a hypothetical example in which a patient who is starting on therapy is really concerned about whether she's going to have GI toxicities or nausea or vomiting in many, at the 3-month mark of her treatment, because she's really looking forward to going on a family vacation at that time. In that case, a healthcare provider can show Project Patient Voice or demonstrate using these visualizations that at month 3, in this case week 12, that 85% of patients, for example, that were in the clinical trial reported no nausea at that time point. So it's really that longitudinal nature of the data that's a huge asset and serves really as a complement to the existing safety data in the label. Next slide. There are many more features to Project Patient Voice that I didn't provide here, and we're really working to expand it beyond the single trial that's on the website currently. I'd like to just mention that we sought feedback from patients and patient advocacy organizations and interest groups all along the way, even as far back as 2 years ago. And the first question we asked before even embarking on this was, will this be useful and will this be used? And we heard resoundingly from patients that they searched this data out on their own anyway, using forums, discussion groups, chats, support groups, and obviously their healthcare team. But it helps to have a repository like this in a trustworthy organization such as FDA providing this data, as opposed to people having to Google search and find academic articles and sift through appendices, or even try and hunt down our FDA product reviews, which are at times very difficult to find. So I just wanted to mention that. And as far as the theme of today, in terms of promoting inclusion and diversity, I just wanted to stress that patient-reported data can provide valuable information, and we just wanted to provide this to the public, and information is power. We're still working on this. This is a work in progress. So we're trying to make it more patient-friendly language. We wanted to, be accurate and patient-friendly. And so we really are working on the patient-friendly aspect of that. We are going back to patients. We're going to have focus groups that include a diverse group of patients to make sure that we get feedback all along the way. And as we, proceed and add more trials to the website, we'll certainly, keep in mind the idea of demographics as well. And so we are listing, patients by race, sex, and age in terms of who the patient population was. So with that, I thank you very much for your time, and I'll turn things back over to Dr. Fashoyin-Aje.
Great. Oh, yeah. Go ahead, Lola.
Oh, no. So thank you, Vishal, and thank you, Jessica. I guess we'll turn it to Brenda now to facilitate a discussion.
Yeah, great. Thank you all so much for those presentations. It's always really exciting to hear about the new initiatives and the various opportunities for patients at FDA. So we really appreciate each of you going through that. And we've gotten a lot of great questions. So thank you, audience. And we'll try to get to as many of these as we can. Lola, I want to start with you. You mentioned part of your job is to coordinate efforts. Could you comment on whether and how other FDA divisions are doing similar work and how those groups might share, or are they sharing best practices within? And I might even extend that to outside of FDA, maybe NIH or other groups, if you could speak to that.
So I don't think that I don't think I would consider myself the expert on what other groups within the FDA are doing. I can tell you that, we have a very active Office of Minority Health and Health Equity that is really leading a lot of the efforts around, community engagement that I spoke about. I think the work that is sort of focused on the particular clinical area is really often kind of deferred to that specific clinical area. And in oncology, we happen to really be, I would say, kind of leading FDA's efforts on many fronts, and including this one, I would say. And so I think, you all are well aware that, the FDA and its sister agencies really have very different sort of purviews. We are not a funding agency like the NIH is. And so we are a regulatory organization. We're also a public health organization, and we regulate across the board on a number of issues in, drugs and cosmetics and food. And so I think that there's just a much more diverse, nature to the kind of work that we do. And so there really is not a lot of too much similarity, although, the mission is the same in terms of promoting, equitable health and access to, the US population. I think that the purview and the authorities are a little bit different.
Yeah, sure, fair. Anyone else want to comment on that? No? Okay. This is a question for everyone. Could you share what do you think is the most surprising thing you've learned from patients that's really changed your thinking or has changed the way your division does its work? So I appreciate your talk on impact and how things have changed. What do you think, each of you, what's the most surprising thing that's really impacted your thinking or the way you work? Lola or anybody can start.
Yeah, I mean, I can start. I think, I think those of us who have taken care of patients or still do take care of patients in the clinic, and those of us whose family members, my husband is a cancer survivor, who have been, experienced that side of things. I think I wouldn't necessarily characterize it as a surprise, but rather as really the thing that motivates us, right? The thing that grounds us into, because you can get caught up into, this is the wrong thing or the right way to approach a scientific issue. But I think when you come back to the central piece of this, which is the patient, it puts a lot of things into perspective. And in many ways, it gives you the answer that you're struggling with. The work that we do is not always, black and white, or, there are lots of gray areas, and we get criticism on both sides. And I think one of the things that's really been great about, Dr. Pazder's leadership is really centering everything on the patient. Once you put the patient in the middle of everything that you do, I think a lot of the difficulty and the criticism that we get, we're able to navigate through that, more easily, because we know that if you put the patient center and first and paramount, then, you just work around that. So I wouldn't necessarily characterize it as a surprise, but more as like really the anchor for all of the work that we do. And so that's why I think in all of the work that we do, we really have sought to get that patient perspective. Even if it's not directly, for a product related matter, we still are bringing that into our clinical experience as physicians, taking care of patients still, survivors ourselves. It's important.
Yeah, absolutely. Jessica, Vishal?
Sure. So I think, just to echo what Dr. Fashoyin-Aje shared, I think hearing from patients just motivates us and adds to the urgency to the work that we do. And I think, our director, Dr. Pazder, as Dr. Fashoyin-Aje mentioned, does a good job about keeping us focused on why we do the work that we do. And I think that motivates us to continue with urgency in all we're working on.
Great.
Yep, I'll just echo again. I agree completely. And one thing that I learned as part of the development of Project Patient Voice, for example, which Dr. Pazder was extremely supportive of, in speaking with patients, specifically one patient advocate, Dicey Scroggins, who mentioned the potential challenges with rigorous or frequent collection of patient-reported outcomes in clinical trials. Is that from the patient perspective, I think we can all agree that we should collect this information, but from the patient perspective, it can be quite cumbersome or challenging, or they may not know why this data is being collected or who's going to see this data and when. And I think from her perspective, she was saying it would help so much if at the beginning of a trial, even at the informed consent process, that that patients are warned that, hey, we're going to be asking you about your symptoms or your side effects, and this is important data. We're going to use it in this way. And you may be asked the same question 3 times in slightly different ways at the same time. And that's going to help the quality of the data. That's going to help patients to understand why they're being asked these questions. And then hopefully that can help better inform patients on the other end of that. So that was a very interesting perspective that I heard. And that was, and I've, as Dr. Fashoyin-Aje mentioned, I've enrolled patients on trials. I have family members on clinical trials, but I didn't quite grasp that sort of, and so it was helpful to talk to patients in that way.
Yeah, no, that's so important. Staying on the topic of impact, one last impact question. Beyond impact on clinical trials, what other impacts have these programs had? Anything you'd like to add on that? Anyone?
When you say these programs, do you mean all of the programs within the Oncology Center of Excellence, or the ones where we've been seeking? I mean, I think, one of the things that I mentioned was that, we have the work that we do, we review applications, we approve drugs, but we also, I think, inform the work that our external stakeholders do, patient advocacy groups, professional organizations like ASCO, and other groups. And I think that regulatory perspective really, gives another side to the issue that allows us to come up, I think, as a research and policy community and advocacy community with, solutions that are more likely to be effective if you are approaching it from a multi-stakeholder, multi-pronged, standpoint. And so I think that, some of that impact is not easy to measure, right? That the FDA participated in this meeting today is not something that you're going to be able to quantify. But our hope is that, the audience has learned a little bit something about what we do, and that sparks, an interest, an idea in their own work in their respective, locales. So it's a long way to say, I don't think we can quantify and measure the impact, and we hope that there is impact by us continuing to try to be transparent about, how we're working.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And in terms of kind of encouraging organizations outside of the FDA, what do you think non-governmental organizations, so industry, patient advocates, what do you think they could be doing to further advance patient engagement in diverse oncology populations? Whoever would like to start.
These are tough questions.
I know. I didn't warn you. These are going to be very, very hard.
I think trying to listen, right? I think, listening to what patients say is important to them is an approach, right? And I think how you do that, there are many ways to do that. But I think a lot of the times the way that even trials are designed, the way that what is identified as the important or critical issue in drug development or in whatever space does not always kind of include, that patient perspective at the outset. It's kind of like, we've identified this thing that we want to do, and now let's bring patients in there. And I think sometimes, having the patient actually inform, the prioritization of like what the thing is that you're trying to work on may be a good approach. I think that it is, since I started doing this work at the FDA, I have seen an evolution and in a culture shift really in terms of, how the patient is integrated in a lot of the work that we're doing. I know a lot of the sort of people who are veterans doing this work will say, we've been doing this since the 60s or 70s, but really in terms of it being something that has, the visibility and where the importance is almost sort of unanimously accepted as adding value to the work that we do, I think is something that has been growing over a number of years now. And so I think, I don't have a great answer for that, but other than to say that I think patients, and patient advocacy groups, there are many now that are in position of actually sort of driving the agenda, right? Deciding what the focus is and seeking all of the various stakeholders and bringing them to the table to advance it. And we do a lot of the work with PanCan, with the Cholangiocarcinoma Foundation. Personally, I've worked with these groups and they are taking charge. They're leading the way. And I think, a lot of the times industry, the government, we're following. And I think in a lot of ways, it should be that way. Patients should tell us where to go and what's important.
Great answer. I have a specific question now. Does a disease need an FDA-approved treatment or a treatment in FDA review for patient representatives to participate in FDA programs?
Sure. So no, it does not. Actually, most of these patient representatives, the FDA patient representatives are advising on drugs that are in development. And for an advisory committee, if they're going to be part of an advisory committee, that's later in development. And that's when, our review teams at FDA are getting close to making a decision on whether or not the drug will be approved. The consults that the representatives provide, that's earlier in development often. And that could be, to help our reviewers get a better sense of the disease or condition. So no, not at all. And most often these drugs are in development and not yet approved. And that's why we're seeking, the advice from the patient representatives.
That's great. Any last thoughts before we close out? I just wanted to give everyone 30 seconds to say anything else they'd like to say before I thank everyone. Vishal, would you like to say something?
Yeah. Sure. Yeah, I just wanted to clear up something that I see a few folks in the chat box had about Project Patient Voice. And I didn't want to get too in the regulatory details about this, but I do want to clarify before we close out. The source of this data is voluntary in terms of Project Patient Voice. It's voluntarily submitted by drug sponsors. So we are not putting data up without drug sponsors being aware. The other factor is that we want data that's very high quality, high fidelity, high completion rate, and frankly that there's not very much data out there that exists that rises to this level. So we have this one case, but our goal was to build it, and if you build it, they will come. And so our hope is that drug trials will have data like this in the future that's very high frequency and high fidelity. And so although every single drug won't be on Project Patient Voice, our hope is that over the years it will grow and many more will join. But again, I just wanted to reiterate that this is a voluntary process.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Well, Jessica, Lola, Vishal, thank you so much for joining us today. This was a wonderful session.